Who are our city streets designed for? Shouldn't they be for all of us? How can we turn them into shared environments which help us make the most of urban life? Interactive projects, such as the EU-funded MORE project, help gather data, develop tools to model traffic flows and road user behavior, co-create road design together with citizens, and assess which options work best. Roadspace.eu.
So what is the MORE project all about? The title says it. It's better streets for better cities, and this is really important. So the website is roadspace.eu, and that's what we will be talking about. This is what we want less of in our cities, and what we want more of is images like this, and this. But how do we get there? The thing is, road space is an extremely scarce and therefore very valuable resource for cities. The good news, however, is that cities are in charge of that road space as well. So by reallocating space, by respacing city streets, they can also really decide which modes they want to prioritize. And that's exactly also what the MORE project has been looking into. How can we build in certain processes and tools to better address the needs of urban street space, but also the conflicting needs of urban street space. It's not always easy to reconcile all the different functions that have been allocated or are being allocated to our streets, not to mention the conflicts between the different modes, all asking for their share of that road space. Instrumental and also important in the MORE project is stakeholder involvement in that respect. We've also been exploring how we can more flexibly and more dynamically make use of that space and maybe allocate different functions throughout the day. And finally, we've been looking into the role of urban nodes in the Trans-European Transport Network and the different responsibilities that this brings along.
As you said, Karen, I want to talk a bit about the broader context in a moment. What I really like about this project is the focus on space, how we use it in cities. How this limited, how this scarce space allocated to mobility is quintessentially shared and needs to be prioritized. We in the Commission have been working a lot and talking a lot about external costs, how we need to, quote unquote, internalize the external costs of our mobility in our horrific jargon. The air and noise pollution, the congestion, the terrible costs of road crashes, which is very telling in terms of numbers, 800 billion to 1 trillion of euros annually of external costs. But if we look at this whole equation differently in terms of space, how it's shared, as the wonderful Philippe Christ at OECD has been urging us to do for some time, is an excellent complement to the cost and benefit analysis from a city perspective. Space on our roads is public space. Space that can and frankly should be adapted to accommodate its safe use by all road users. That space is not inherently free, in either sense of the word, for the driving of cars or for the parking of cars. And if you ask any city official, maybe we should ask Pascal, what the hardest issue they face, they'll often say it is access restrictions in favor of buses or pedestrians or cyclists, closely followed by parking or parking fees. And it's the sense that too many people still have, in my opinion, that there is an inherent right to drive or park your car on public space. And that's still out there, bubbling away. And that lies behind these difficulties. And it's not a coincidence that cities across Europe have found it very hard, for example, to raise the level of annual parking fees to anything close to the real costs of that of action. So this MORE project is also great because it brings, if you like, the mobility experts and the planning guys into the same room, into the same analysis, if you like, which I gather has not always been the case. And last but not least, you're catching the COVID, or indeed post-COVID wave, hopefully, where everyone, and not just the transport nerds amongst us, have become so much more conscious about the role of space in our cities, from just how big cars have got, to the reallocation of parking spaces to enable people to line up outside shops, or to enable them to eat more safely outside in Brussels' famously good weather, which, as we know, is perfect for al fresco dining. In the meantime, what MORE has put on the table in terms of its key recommendations for policy and process is, in my view, an essential building block to the work we face in the Commission and beyond. So I'd like to just close by saying thank you very much for this great work, and I look forward to hearing more of the details this morning. Thank you very much.
Most urban main roads in Europe were designed with private cars in mind. Today, people are seeking greener, more livable, and less polluted cities. As mobility patterns change, while lifestyles and technologies evolve, streets must be adapted to the needs of today's cities.
You know, as Karen has said, many of you who came in the past in Brussels will remember, and maybe somehow in some quarters of the city, see Brussels as a city for cars. For the ones who know a little bit Brussels, this is right in the center of Brussels. Le Vieux Marché aux Grains, a couple of years ago, it was like this, and today it is like that. And that's, of course, the transformation from a city for cars to a city for people that we have now been doing the last 10 years. What did we do in Brussels? First of all, we made car-free squares. I don't know if you remember this place. Some of you who might know Brussels. It's a place where Europeans, Eurocrats, visitors like a lot. It's La Place Flagey. It's right at the crossroads in Brussels in some area where you have rich and poor, immigrants, non-immigrants coming together. And it used to be like that. Today, it is like that. So it's a car-free square. And we started with car-free squares because we wanted to give the message to people, it can be different, you know. You can meet each other on a square, and everybody likes a square when the square is there. Of course, the process of getting. Another thing you're doing is creating new public space. For instance, parks. This is not far away in the center. It used to be a kind of no man's land, and today you see you have a green area. This is an evolutive park, which means we start with not much things, less, a bit less is more. But people, when they use the park, they can say, we want this, we want more trees, we want more this and that. So that will come in the future. Brussels, after war, thought it had to be a very modern city, you know. We were going to copy the American model of cities, which of course was a big mistake, but we destroyed neighborhoods, we built flyovers, we made highways in the city, and then we got this kind of infrastructure. And what we want to do now is to limit access to the city. Of course, we remain accessible for the commuters, but no longer with 5 lanes in every direction. So we are reducing the space to that. And what we are also be doing is demolishing flyovers that don't really have a use. This used to be a big, very known flyover, Reyers, in Brussels. It's gone today, and people are happy. Now the definite works will start to make a nice urban boulevard of that. Then the whole thing was, by doing that, is changing the mentality in the city. So people have to get another mindset, because people grew up, as Matthew said, with the whole idea of cars. It's natural, it's a thing, it's a natural thing. But actually, I'm pretty convinced that our kids or grandkids, they will learn in school that the biggest mistake that mankind has ever made was the invention of the private owned car for cities. I'm sure. That will be said and taught in lessons.
To tackle these challenges, let's rethink how we use our road space. The design of our streets should enable different road users to move with ease. This will create more breathable cities, where street space is shared safely and comfortably. But changing our streets is not just a technical issue. It's a political, social, and economic process involving each of us.
Dealing with street space also depends on the priorities of policymakers, and the first 2 presentations showed that these priorities have been changing over the years. And we can see that in many European cities, the political priorities have changed in the last 50 or 60 years, and we can identify 3 stages. With the first stage being the car-oriented city. This was at the time, 50 or 60 years ago, when car use was increasing, car ownership was increasing, so the political priority was to improve car mobility. And we have typical interventions like new roads, new car parking areas, and also the segregation of modes, but giving priority to motorized modes. And then after some years, we started to see a change, not only in people's behavior, but also in political priorities. So we started to see in many European cities that car use started to level out, and then the political priorities also changed, with more priority being given to public transport and to walking and cycling. And interventions include improving public transport, walking and cycling infrastructure. Most cities in Europe now are at the 3rd stage, where car use and car ownership is actually starting to decline. So the political priorities are also changing towards higher priority to place making, creating new green areas, new parks, new places where people can relax and just enjoy outdoor life if weather allows. And interventions include improving the quality of streets, more green areas, including public spaces. So we are starting to see this in many European cities and also in other parts of the world. So a change in travel behavior, but also a change in political priorities. So MORE considers all street uses, not only movement, but also place activities. We also try to improve the modeling of the conflicts, the interactions between street users, especially the interactions between vehicles and pedestrians, and also the parking activities. MORE considers, and where possible, it measures or even monetizes the wider aspects, the wider economic, social, and environmental aspects of street space allocation. We also explore new technical solutions. We integrate the stakeholder engagement in the allocation process from the start. We also make the political priorities explicit. So they are always implicit, but we make them explicit in some of the tools that we have developed.
Interactive projects, such as the EU-funded MORE project, help gather data, develop tools to model traffic flows and road user behavior, co-create road design together with citizens, and assess which options work best.
Underlying MORE was a set of concepts and principles that we've developed and applied through the project. Some we've developed ourselves, some we've drawn on from previous EU projects. And I just want to briefly outline them. In fact, to save time, I'll just go through them one by one without introducing them there. The first is the distinction between roads and streets. In each of our 5 cities, we've taken what we call a feeder route coming in from the national TEN-T network into the centre of that city. And on the feeder route, as you come into the centre, you find 2 very different situations. And we've characterised those as roads and streets. So in the outer areas, effectively you have expressways where it's essentially for moving mechanised traffic. There are very few interchanges and there are no buildings directly on the streets. They're effectively urban motorways or semi-urban motorways, and they tend to have very high traffic flows, primarily cars. As you move towards the centre of these cities, then they morph into what we're calling streets, where you also have pedestrians and cyclists, you have buildings fronting the streets, you have loading, parking, buses dropping off people, pedal cycles and so on, people crossing the road. So they're much more intensive and interactive situations, and the volumes of traffic or movement tend to be less, and the dominance of car is also less as these other modes become more important. The second thing is picking up on a point that Paolo made earlier, that as we change up, we heard this morning in the presentation from Brussels, as policy priorities change, then the things you implement on the ground change as well. So without repeating fully what Paolo said, so historically, we heard in Brussels an example was developed to become a car city with lots of car parking and squares, wide movement corridors, etc., through to now where it's becoming a city of places, supported by sustainable transport, but with much more focus on placemaking, livability, and active traffic restraint. And this change in focus, as we saw in Brussels, and I'll give an example from London, makes a big difference on the ground. So this is just to the east of the financial city of London. In the 1950s, 60s, a big roundabout, we call it gyratory, was put in to try and maximise traffic capacity around the centre of London. You can see there's a church sort of rather abandoned in the middle there. And then 3 years ago, a big change in policy. The idea was to promote access by sustainable modes and to put a big focus on placemaking. So most of that carriageway space was taken out, and you can see there's a park there that's used by office workers and so on during the day, and by residents lunchtime in the evening and at weekends. So it makes a huge difference. And as part of that, we made a strong distinction or recognition that streets have multiple functions. Roads less so. Roads are primarily concerned with movement, not exclusively, but streets have multiple functions, and we put those under 2 different categories. One relating to movement by all modes of transport, and the other one relating to place. And place includes things that relate to the street as a destination, whether it's parking or loading, or people meeting friends there, or shopping, or whatever. And the thing that this brings in is the whole idea of street activities, that streets as destination are brought to life, as Paolo indicated, by their social, economic and environmental presence. And here's some photographs illustrating the way that communities use streets for different purposes. We then moved on, as Elaine mentioned in her presentation, to think about the street as a whole ecosystem, so that you have the carriageway, you have the movement and street activity, beneath that you have the utilities, and you have metro systems and so on. And then on either side, they're fronted by buildings, and above we have airspace that is now important for Wi-Fi and for GPS, and in future potentially will become very important for drones. And the point is that all these things are interacting in various ways. When we get to looking at how we can actually tackle streets and improve streets, then really there are three broad levers that policymakers have. One is physical. We can actually determine the amount of space on the street that we allocate for different things like parking and so on. Also regulation, where we control which particular types of people can use the street or can park or stop at the side of the street. And there we really do those regulations based on three criteria. Some are based on the type of person, so a resident can use this parking space or use this street, or a disabled person. Others are based on the type of activity, so no access except for loading, for example. And the third is based on the type of vehicle, so buses only, cycles only. So we have quite a rich tapestry of regulations that can be very fine-tuned to the individual requirements of streets. And on top of that, we also use pricing quite often to regulate demand, congestion charging for traffic, or encouraging compliance with low emission, or also to look at to control the demand for parking. And what we find actually is that these things are quite sophisticated, that when you look at a street, it's a combination of physical, regulatory and pricing measures that are used to achieve the objectives we're trying to meet. Moving on, street design zones and street design elements. Essentially, you have a building line on either side, you have a footway, you have a carriageway, but within that there are lots of sub-elements where you can allocate space to a range of different street users. The other thing is the importance of recognising context, that we shouldn't have a standard design everywhere, clearly. It depends on context. And here's an example from a previous EU project called Artists, looking at a radial route into Freiburg, where in the outer areas, in the residential area, the street is quite wide, so there are separate lanes for trams, buses, cycles, some parking, pedestrian space. As you come towards the centre of Freiburg, the space becomes more restricted, but because place is becoming more important, it's a commercial retail centre, more of that space is now given to parking and loading, and more trees and so on. There was the case further out. But because there's less space, you have to squeeze. And finally, flexibility in space allocation. There are so many pressures and tensions on the road, but they do vary dramatically, the demands by time of day. Here's an example from one street near central London. The red shows the variation in parking activity along the curb by time of day. Loading is in blue, and drop-off is in grey. And you can see there are strong peaks and troughs. And so the point there really is, if we understand that demand varies by time of day, and also politically we may want to encourage things at some times and not others, we need to have methods of space allocation and regulation that are much more flexible and potentially dynamic. As we have more sensors, we can actually tell on a particular day what the demands are, and potentially we can therefore change the regulation and the way we use that space on an hour-by-hour basis. And we've been carrying out some trials using LED signs and road markings so that we could actually convey to motorists and other users how that space is adapting to the demands on that particular day. So that's a very quick run through some of the concepts and principles. You'll hear more later. Thank you very much.
First of all, we're going to have a look at the more tools. So you've heard about them a little bit, but we're going to go into more details about how the cities have applied these tools that have been developed and validated over the last months in the 5 cities. And then after that, we're going to hear from the 5 cities and how they applied these tools and use them to help the stakeholder engagement process, the design, the evaluation, the appraisal of their street design options. So just by way of introduction, there really is a rationale for the tools that we've been developing and using in the projects. Currently, there are quite a lot of gaps in street design consultation and the process of space allocation. Quite often, the options which are generated, they exclude key stakeholders and groups of the public. Modeling doesn't always capture, right now, the value of all street functions. In particular, place functions. The movement function is normally well assessed, but the place function, there is still some gaps there. Also, the assessment can be quite narrow because of a lack of tools to do full appraisal. And these gaps are made even sort of larger with the advent of all these new mobility services that we're seeing on the streets today. When I arrived at Gare Midi yesterday, there were lots of e-scooters everywhere, quite neatly grouped together, which was good to see. But it just shows that's one element of how the street space is there's extra demands. So there's a real rationale for this approach, and Moore has addressed this through a co-creation approach of using these tools that can better consider better the needs of more users. How do we make streets more efficient to more users? And we've done so through these 5 principal tools on the right-hand side. And at each step of the street design process, we have been applying and validating one or more of these tools. So step 1 is to identify what the current challenges are with a particular street. And to do that, we can use TraffWeb, which is a public consultation tool that you can use online. You can also get input from experts and stakeholders, as well as members of the public. Step 2 is to generate high-level design options, and that's enhanced by using the option generation tool. Step 3 is then to focus on the selected street in detail, and for that we can use line map to actually layer on top what the proposed new street layout would look like, and that can really help the discussions with experts on how that might best work. Then step 4 is assessing and evaluating the street options, and to do that we have an enhanced version of Vism, and also the appraisal tool, which helps on the evaluation side. And then step 5, you have a choice whether to refine the design options, or whether you can take one of those options forward and recommend it for implementation.
I'm just going to talk through the things that we've developed. So a set of concepts and principles, up-to-date intelligence on street user guides, and the numbers there are deliverables where you can find more detail. A comprehensive analysis of institutional organisational factors, we heard from Charlotte. Looking to the future about new technologies and so on, we heard from Men. And then a comprehensive street design process, which you've heard about this afternoon, with this whole suite of tools taking us through from option generation through appraising alternative designs. And then a series of case studies you've heard this afternoon, and we have deliverables that go into detail, sometimes hundreds of pages of detail, on each of these elements where you can drill down a lot further.
More and more cities and their inhabitants are embracing the redistribution of road space as a way to create more livable environments. Together, we can reinvent the urban spaces we share. Together, we can make our cities more livable. roadspace.eu